Give me the Bible, star of gladness gleaming, to cheer the wanderer lone and tempest-tossed. No storms can hide that radiance peaceful beaming, since Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible when my heart is broken, when sin and grief have filled my soul with fear. Give me the precious words by Jesus spoken. Hold up faith's lamp to show my Savior near. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible, all my steps enlighten, teach me the dangers of these realms below. That lamp of safety o'er the gloom shall brighten, that light alone the path of peace can show. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible, lamp of life immortal, hold up the splendor by the open grave. Show me the light from heaven's shining portals, show me the glory gilding Jordan's wave. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Break thou the bread of life, dear Lord, to me, as thou didst break the loaves beside the sea. Beyond the sacred page, I seek thee, Lord. My spirit pants for thee, O living word. Bless thou the truth, dear Lord, to me, as thou didst bless the bread by Galilee. Then shall all bondage cease, all fetters fall, and I shall find my peace, my all in all.
Hello, hello. How are we this fine Monday afternoon? I didn't realize this shirt would be this bright. How are we doing? We have CJ here with us. He says, hey, everyone. Good to have you with us, CJ. Yesterday in my Bible class, I had CJ as a lifeline. Hi, Reba. Good to have you with us. How are you doing, sister? Hope that you're all doing okay, having a good Monday. CJ, is your family still in town or have they left?
I think they're leaving today.
Okay. We'll wish them some safe travels. Reba says, I'm doing. How are you? I'm doing great. There's a guy at church, older guy. He says that to me every time. I'll go up to him. I'll say, how you doing? And he'll say, oh, I'm doing. We are getting pretty close to the end of the book of Revelation. If the Lord wills, I think we'll finish it next week. But in the meantime, we have today, and today's study, let me get situated here. In today's study, we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 21. Chapters 21 and 22 are probably the most looked at chapters in the book of Revelation, I would guess. The early chapters, like the first 3 chapters, they're looked at a lot. Chapters 4 and 5 are looked at quite a bit. And of course, chapter 20 we looked at last week. There's a lot of discussion about all of that. But chapters 21 and 22 are kind of the more positive chapters. And in these chapters, we read about heaven. We read about what heaven is like. And we'll talk some about that here this afternoon. So this is, of course, the study to show ourselves approved. And we are in lesson 21, covering Revelation chapter 21. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's spend a minute reviewing some of what we've looked at in the most recent studies here. So one way that you could look at Revelation, I don't know that it's the way, but one way you could look at it is that it is largely about the battle between good last week in chapter 20. And so the usage of war language throughout this book is a big indicator of that. And we spent some time looking at that a little bit last week. We saw some of the war language before. There's the part, I believe it's in chapter 17, they will wage war on the Lamb, but of course that doesn't work, right? The Lamb will conquer them. So there's a lot of language such as waging war and conquering and so on and so forth. You're frozen, your back. My back is frozen. I'm just pointing out CJ's grammatical mistake. I apologize if I freeze. My internet should be fine, but I didn't notice that I had frozen, but maybe I did. So there's a lot of usage of war language throughout the book. The idea of conquering and waging war and so on and so forth, that's used repeatedly. And we need to remember that this is an apocalypse. And by apocalypse, I don't mean like what the world thinks of when they think of the apocalypse coming. This is a specific genre of Jewish literature that has this war-like kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? that's kind of in the foreknowledge of people's minds in apocalyptic literature, is this war kind of thing. And there's also heavy usage of symbolism and so on. But this book also describes itself as prophecy. And so there's events that are being revealed in the future, and we've seen some of those as they've shaped out. And so one question to ask is, what benefit would this have for first century Christians? Because this is when the book of Revelation was written, is in the first century, toward the end of that. So what benefit would this give to Christians living under that time period? Well, of course, the major thing that was happening at that time for the church was the persecution at the hand of the Romans. The Roman government was hostile towards Christianity and towards Christians. And so it could seem like when you're in that situation, and it can seem like that even today still, where you have good and evil, sort of these forces that be, combating against each other. And it can seem like when you look around that the evil is winning against the good. Well, in this book, we see that the good does win, and the victory has been won, and that took place at the cross when Jesus was the sacrifice for our sins and when he was raised on that third day. So this would have been a book, I think, of comfort for those Christians back then, and it can serve as a book of comfort for us as well, knowing, like the promise in chapter 2 and verse 10, if we're faithful to the end, if we're faithful to the point of death, then we will receive that crown of life. And this book is riddled with various aspects such as that. So I think that would be something that would benefit the first century Christians, certainly. Last week we studied chapter 20. In chapter 20, primarily, you could put it different ways, but it's about the defeat of evil. And so you see here the dragon. The dragon is Satan, and he is bound, and he's later thrown into the lake of fire. That is, of course, the second death. Judgment, the judgment scene of the great white throne. Those whose names are not in the book of life would experience that second death. And so we saw that at the end of chapter 20. And so now, after all of that, we see that the victory has been won. Well, now what? Where do you go from here? Well, what we see in these next couple of chapters is we see what the end result will be of all of that, where we will be. And so we get a little bit of a description of our heavenly home here. It's almost like, how sometimes if you're shopping for a house, you may, before you purchase it, you go and you take a tour of that house, and you look around and you look at, the dimensions of the house, and you look at all the details of it, what year it was built, and the amenities it has, and so on and so forth. Well, this is, in a way, a tour of the home that we will eventually have. So let me find, here we go. Revelation 21, and here I'll make this bigger so that it's easier to see. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. Verse 7. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for the murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. And on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. Verse 18. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold, like clear glass. The foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst. Verse 21. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring glory to it. And its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations, but nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. Okay. Give me just a second, CJ. Wouldn't this be a description of the bride that is coming out of heaven in a glorified state? Some people think that. I could see why people would think that. It seems to me that it can refer to both the place where we will be and also, the people. It's an interesting question. Let me get back to that. Okay, chapter 21. So, the chapter begins with another vision from John. He says, I saw. And so this is something that he sees. It's a vision. And we touched on this a little bit last week, how there are these 7 visions that John has from chapter 19 through now. The last one is here in chapter 21. So these are some of the other ones. John sees in Revelation 19 and verse 11, the white horse, the one who will tread the winepress of the fury of God's wrath. The next one is in chapter 19 and verse 17. John sees the birds gathering for the great supper of God. That's the bad supper that you don't want to be part of. Then in chapter 19 and verse 19, John sees the beast in his army get defeated and thrown into the lake of fire. Then we saw three more in chapter 20. In verse 1, John sees the dragon get bound. The dragon is Satan, right? Then in verse 4, John sees the millennium and the defeat of the dragon. The millennium is that 1,000-year period. That, of course, we talked about last week, is a symbolic 1,000 years. And then in chapter 20 and verse 11, John sees the great white throne and the judgment scene thereafter. And so each of these visions is, you can tell it's a vision because John says, and I saw, or he'll say something like, and behold this. It's something that is seen, right? And so there are these 7 visions, and they all take place one right after the other. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. It seems like these visions have something in common. So what do they have in common? It seems to me that they all are portraying the defeat of evil and the triumph of good. And that's kind of like what we talked about at the beginning. You could say that the book of Revelation depicts the battle of good versus evil. And here we saw good coming out on top. Lost you for a second, CJ. You're back. And so now, with evil defeated, what can this vision show us? This vision being the 7th one. It's culminated through the first 6. What's the 7th vision about? Well, he says here, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. This is what he sees here in this chapter. This is the vision. It's the new heaven. And so with the victory having been won, it now comes time, when you get to chapter 21, to reap the benefits of that. For those who are in the Lamb's book of life, to receive that inheritance and to go to that new, you could call it a new promised land. Something that's worth mentioning here is, of course, that John sees a new heaven and a new earth. And let me just show you. If we go up, I apologize for the whiplash. Scrolling kind of quickly. This word new, he sees a new heaven and a new earth. The word there is kainos. And, there's a couple ways this can be used. One, let me make that a little bigger. One is pertaining to being in existence for a relatively short time. So you could say new or unused. Another one, and I think this fits better, is pertaining to being not previously present, so on and so forth. And then this one also fits, also pertaining to that which is recent in contrast to something old. Being contrasted with each other. So I think this especially fits this third definition here. And so we see here that there's a new heaven and a new earth. And the reason for that is because the first heaven and the first earth have passed away. So the old ones are gone. They have passed away. That's how there are these new ones that have now come into the picture. And so what is this going to look like? There's a lot of debate about this. What will happen to the old earth and the old heaven, and, what this will look like. Will the earth literally be destroyed? Well, that imagery is used elsewhere in Scripture. Think about 2 Peter chapter 3. Talks about the, heavens passing away and the earth being dissolved. So if you take that literally, and I think you should, then this earth that we're on now will eventually, it'll be destroyed. And people debate whether it's literal or symbolic or so on and so forth. And I don't want to focus on that too much. I think it's literal. But whether it's literal or symbolic is the least of our concerns, because point being, we're not going to be here anymore. We'll be on that new one. It won't matter to us what happens to that old one, because we'll be on the new one. That won't be our concern. So then John sees the new Jerusalem that's descending out of heaven in verse 2. And this is kind of what CJ was touching on in his comment. Because this holy city is described as a bride that's been adorned for her husband. Well, we know that the scriptures, tell us in more than one place that the church is like the bride of Christ. And so what we see is that the New Jerusalem, as it's being used here, it's an image that's representing the entirety of God's people, that of course, being the church. So in a sense, the church is like a new Israel, right? We all have that common spiritual heritage. It's not a physical heritage, but it's a spiritual one. And there's, of course, the imagery that's used periodically of the church as the bride of Christ. However, you can see as you get further into it, you can see how the imagery kind of shifts from the people of God to the dwelling place where the people of God will be. And we'll touch on that as we get a little further in. Verse 3 is one of my favorite verses in this chapter. John hears a voice, and the voice says, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man." And it's interesting how this is phrased. Let me look at this. The voice, notice it's from the throne, right? This voice. And it says, "The dwelling place of God is with man, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them as their God." So notice how this is phrased. It's not that we will go and dwell with God, but God will dwell with us. It's him that initiates the dwelling here. And that's a very important point to make, because there's really nothing we can do to go and be in the presence of God, but God makes his presence with us. He comes to us. That's how that happens. And this is, of course, reminiscent of John 1 and verse 14, where John writes that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And it's interesting, I noticed that the word that's dwelt in John chapter 1 and the word dwelling place in Revelation 21 are the same word. It's just one is a verb and one is a noun, or whatever the grammatical function of that is. I guess it's a noun. So the word literally means tabernacle or dwelling place. And so you have the Word became flesh and dwelt among us in John 1. And then you have, the dwelling place of God being with man in this chapter. And in both of those instances, it's not us going to God, but it's God coming to us. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And it shows us some of, God's relationship with us, because he comes down to us. And what a great thing that is. No other religious deity can say such a thing, right? No other God has ever come to earth in the way that Jesus has. And we have that promise here in this chapter as well. So we see that God will dwell with, well, obviously. There we go. I left for a second. Am I back, CJ? I look like I'm back. It's saying my connection is unstable, but it comes and goes, I've noticed. I don't know why that is, but so this cohabitation is an intimate one. And you'll see what I mean by that. It says that they will be his people, and God himself, that's emphatic, God himself will be with them as their God. It's not like God is going to, send an angel to go be with them. It's going to be him himself that's going to be there as their God. And that, of course, echoes a lot of Old Testament language about Israel. When he makes the covenant with Israel, you'll be my people, you'll be, I will be your God, you'll be my people, that kind of thing. Excuse me. Another thing we see here that really shows the intimacy is when it says he will wipe every tear from their eyes. And this is another way of expressing intimacy. You don't just go up to someone and wipe the tears from their eyes unless you really know them, right? That's kind of a weird thing to do. Well, God is going to do that for us. He wipes the tears from our eyes. That's another sign of intimacy that he will have with his people. So as we go through the rest of this chapter, he'll wipe every tear from their eyes. Verse 4, death will be no more. There'll be no more mourning or crying or pain, which, for those of us who are mourning or who are in pain, this is just wonderful news. And this is a great thing that we have to look forward to. And we come and eventually we come to the New Jerusalem. He carried me away on a high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. And I think this is talking about heaven. Other people may think it's talking about the church. I could see how people would think that, but it seems like the imagery shifts. So what we see is the rest of this chapter seems to answer the question, what will heaven be like? And, it's interesting. First, we see that John tells us what will not be in heaven. And it's those things in verses 4 and 5. Death shall be no more. There'll be no more mourning. There'll be no more crying. There'll be no more pain. Those former things, they have passed away. These things will not be in heaven. And the reason for that is because God is going to make all things new. And so those old things, they're history. They're toast, or they will be. And what a great thing that we have to look forward to. No more mourning or crying or pain. Those things pass away. God will make all things new. And in the newness of that, these things will not be there. What a great promise that is. We also see who will not be in heaven. So we've looked at what won't be in heaven. Then we see who won't be in heaven. It's the one who conquers, who has this heritage, as we see. Let's see, where was that at? Verse 7, the one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. So it's the one who conquers who will have this heritage, the one who will be in heaven. The heritage is being able to partake in the spring of the water of life that is mentioned in the previous verse, in verse 6. I am the Alpha and the Omega. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. And it's to the one who conquers who has that heritage. So my phone is buzzing. Let me silence that real quick. I don't know if y'all can hear it, but it's sitting on the table and I hear it. Okay. But notice who will not be in heaven. Verse 8, it's those who are cowardly, those who are faithless, the detestable, the murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars. Their heritage is destined for the lake of fire, and that is the second death, like we see in verse 8. And you see here, cowardly, faithless, detestable, murderers, sexually immoral. Which sexually immoral, that encompasses many different people, right? That's not just the fornicators, but also the adulterers and also the homosexuals and so on and so forth. That term is all encompassing. It's an inclusive term referring to different kinds of people. You also have sorcerers and idolaters and all liars. And we see that their portion is in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur. And so these people won't be there. Have you ever, when people make plans, have you ever asked, well, who's going to be there? Because if so-and-so is going to be there, then I don't really care to be there. What we have waiting for us, those people, they're not going to be there. And what a great promise that is, of course, for us, knowing that they won't be there. Next, John is led by an angel, and this is one of the angels who had those bowls of wrath, those plagues that were laid out in some of the previous chapters. And what he sees here is the wife of the Lamb. And what he's seeing is the church in its fulfilled state and in its fulfilled place. The church, right? Because this is it's a spiritual kingdom. And so we're going to finally be part of that in its rightful place. We're still just sojourners here at the moment. This world, of course, is not our home. Our citizenship is in heaven. Well, this is the description of what that citizenship will look like. And so what we see is it has the glory of God, and its radiance is like a most rare jewel. And that, of course, reminds us the radiance of Moses leaving Sinai and, of course, Christ being transfigured on the mountain, the radiance of glory that came from those instances. So then what follows is John saying many different things about heaven, or about, the bride, however you want to interpret it. And it's interesting because some of these are pretty straightforward things, but some of these are not. There's a lot of imagery and a lot of symbolism that's used, and we want to remember that as we read through all of Revelation, but especially this part. And keep in mind that most, if not all, of what we find in Revelation is symbolic, and this is not an exception to that. And so what tends to happen is we over-allegorize some of this, where we say, well, that means this and that means that, and so on and so forth. We could do that, but I don't like doing that. So what we'll do instead is try to look at the big picture at what these images are conveying, and this will be the rest of our study. So there's 5 things that I want to draw to your attention about what we read in the rest of this chapter. I'm going to assume that this is talking about heaven, but you can assume something else. But regardless, we see that this is what these symbols are sort of talking about. The first thing we see is that heaven is glorious. It is radiating the glory of God. It mentions that its radiance is like a most rare jewel, like we just looked at. We see also some instances where there's a lot of, these jewels come up now and again. The wall is built of jasper, the city of pure gold, like clear glass. And so it's pretty clear that this is a glorious thing that's being conveyed to us here. We see also that the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. And so we see here the glory, or you could even go as far as saying the beauty of what this will be like, what heaven is like. And people will say things like, well, they'll talk about how the gates have pearls, and so you hear it called the pearly gate, right? You've heard that, I'm sure. And the streets of gold and so on. And I'm not sure if we should take those things literally. It'll look pretty good if it's literally like that, but I think it's conveying something much more for us here. So that's one thing. Another thing is that heaven is big. It's really big. Sometimes you walk in, like I can remember the first time I walked into Sam's Club when I was a kid. That store, and you could say the same thing about Costco, it just feels so big when you're that young, right? You just walk in and it's just wide open, and there's just so many things you could buy. And some places you go to and you think, wow, this place is huge. This place is really, really big. Heaven, how much bigger, of course, is that? There's a scene here where an angel measures the city with his rod, and the measurement that he gets from that is 12,000 stadia. There's a footnote that I want to draw to your attention that the English Standard has, and I would bet other versions have something similar. This footnote here, let's see, where's that at? What verse? It's right in here somewhere. 12,000 stadia. You see this footnote here. It says about 1,380 miles. A stadion was about 607 feet or 185 miles. So it says 1,380 feet would be the measurement of that. I'm not sure that that's accurate, but that's in the footnote of the English Standard. And so 1,380 miles is what they say. Some versions go as far as saying 1,500 miles. If you have like a New King James, I think it might say something like that. And so there's the footnote. Regardless, this is a really, really big measurement here, right? That's a long tape measure. That's a long rod. And so just as a visual, if you take the literal number, whether it's 1,300 or 1,500, if you were to make a box of that, because remember the city is 4 square. So if you take a big square that's about that long and you put it in a map of the United States, this is what it would look like. This right here. This is the 4 square. And so this is, of course, really big, right? Imagine someone having a house that big. That would be kind of crazy. So that's just a visual that you can look at. So it's a giant cube. It's 4 square. It says that its length, its width, and its height are all the same. So length, length, width, height, all the same. And so this is pretty big, right? We've been studying on Wednesday nights at the Mount Morris congregation through the book of Nehemiah. And CJ said, I would get lost in that house. It wouldn't be hard to get lost in there. Some houses you go to that are just, normal, like let's say, like fairly big houses, like let's say 2,000 square feet or so. It's easy to get lost even in some of those, if you're not familiar with it. And so, but as I was saying, we've been studying Nehemiah on Wednesday nights, and we got to the part in chapter 12 where they dedicate the walls. And it mentions in here that they walked on top of the walls. There's this little procession that happens, and they walk along the wall on the top of it. And most people think, well, that's bogus. How can you walk on top of a wall? Well, there's archaeological evidence that suggests that the walls of the city of Jerusalem at that time, when Nehemiah arranged for that to be built, that they were 9 feet wide. And that's plenty of room for someone to walk on, all right? You could walk side by side with somebody on there. You might even be able to get 3 people walking side by side on there. Well, if 9 feet is like that, think about 1,380 miles or 1,500 miles. That's just an absurd, distance to have. And that's the length, the width, and the height. So have you ever wondered, one second here. Have you ever wondered, I double clicked. Have you ever wondered if there's enough room in heaven for everybody? It's not going to be like hotels where you got to get there before all of the vacancies fill up. That won't happen in heaven. There's room for everybody who will be part of it. Another thing we see is that heaven is secure. We mentioned that the city has this great wall, 144 cubits. And so around the big city, there is this wall. And whether that is the height or the thickness of the wall, it's still an impressive wall, right? And nobody's going to be able to climb it or be able to scale it. 144 cubits is fairly large. We also see that the city has these gates, and the gates are made of pearl. And when you think about gates, there's purposes behind gates. It's usually to either keep people in or to keep people out, right? And in this case, the gates, it's also a way for people to go through in that sense. But usually if there's a gate and it's shut, you're keeping people out, right? And that's kind of the idea here with heaven. But heaven is so secure. In verse 25, we see that the gates aren't even closed. They're open. And, that conveys an invitation for anyone and everyone who wants to be part of it. If they're willing to obey the gospel and be added to the Lord's church, they can be part of that, right? That invitation stands still today. It won't be here forever, but it stands at this very moment. And heaven is so secure, they don't even have to shut the gates, which is a really interesting thing. Next, we see that heaven is pure. And we touched on this a little bit before, but notice who is not in heaven. It's all those who live these sinful and unfaithful lives, those who are unrepentant, those who do not obey the gospel, right? Because we live sinful lives also. We sin, but we are repentant, right? We have obeyed the gospel if we're Christians. And it's interesting how despite those gates being open, nothing unclean will ever enter into it, nor will anyone enter in who does what is described as being detestable or false. We see that in verse 27. And so it's pure. Those evil, corruptible things aren't getting in. Those evil, corruptible people, they're not getting in. Instead, it's only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life, and that, of course, is the church, right? Those who have obeyed the gospel, those who have been faithful. And it's those who will enter in. And so we see that heaven is pure. And finally, we see that heaven is new. Heaven is new. And what I mean by that is it's in a qualitative sense. Sometimes you may get a new car and it may be like a car that you had before. Imagine if you had a little, really little car and all of a sudden you get this big truck, right? It's new in that sense. It's not like anything you've had before. It's not a new version of something that already exists, but it's different, right? The likes of which haven't been seen. And it's new because the old has been done away with. In verse 4, we see that the former things have passed away. And in verse 5, we see that God makes all things new. So there's this newness to this. And this, of course, is consistent with the message of the gospel. When we die with Christ, we are raised with him, and we have this newness of life after we have become Christians, after we've put on Christ in baptism. And so, we die with him, we're raised with him. And, the Bible tells us that we're a new creature in that sense, right? And so heaven in the same way is new. It's unlike anything that has been seen. It's unlike anything that we have experienced. So that takes us to the end of our study this afternoon. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them. I think I should be able to be on next week. I don't see why I can't at the moment. So we've got one more chapter. Chapter 22 is coming. And Lord willing, we'll get to that next week. And after that, this study will be done. And I know there's plans for a study to follow up mine. That's not my thing to announce, but when it's appropriate, I'll let your servants, CJ and Levi, make mention of that. But I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your attention, and I appreciate your participation. Thanks again for being here.